Well, it's a real great pleasure to be here. I think this is a wonderful event, bridging different institutions and also different disciplines. And it's been fabulous to see the different perspectives from law, philosophy, ethics, political science. Let me add my thanks to Mike, Mark, everybody else who's involved in putting on this wonderful event. Now, unwinnable war might seem like a strange topic to talk about at Villanova, a university that doesn't know the meaning of unwinnable. But nevertheless, it is important and relevant. So in 2004, the Iraq War was unwinnable. The country had descended into civil conflict. There were rival sectarian militias, multiple insurgencies. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was very active. The Abu Ghraib scandal had broken, delegitimizing the American war effort. And there was no plausible path by which the United States could achieve a clear victory. For the United States, the Iraq War was a traumatic experience, but it was not an unusual experience. In fact, Iraq is part of a string of unwinnable wars that the US has endured from Korea through Afghanistan. So when a military campaign deteriorates, officials face not just stark strategic dilemmas, but also stark moral challenges. How can Washington extricate the nation from a quagmire in an ethical manner? The fall of South Vietnam to communism in 1975, for example, triggered a wave of repression, and of course boat people left Vietnam. But to continue fighting in Vietnam in a bid to save the civilians of the country might well have just been a futile effort that ended up killing more civilians. Or think today about Afghanistan. Should the rights of women in Afghanistan be sacrificed in a bid to reach a negotiated deal with the Taliban and end the war? These are not easy questions for Americans to think about. The United States is a victory culture. Just consider that every year Americans spend $3 billion just on trophies. But although it's difficult, it's highly important. So what I'm going to do in this paper is build on some arguments in my most recent book, came out a couple months ago, The Right Way to Lose a War, which is a book that looks at why the US has struggled so much on the battlefield since 1945 and how the United States can get out of a war once it deteriorates. And I'm going to think about the ethical aspects of the exit strategy, focusing mainly on the US experience. So of course, you're all familiar with just war theory, principles of ad bellum or when to fight wars, principles of in bello or rightful conduct, principles of post bellum, or justly settling post-conflict issues. How does just war theory apply to an unwinnable war, or a military campaign where decisive victory is no longer plausible? So what I mean by victory here is achieving the state's goals with a favorable cost-benefit analysis. So if the enemy's resistance proves greater than we expect, or perhaps our allies jump ship, or domestic divisions occur, it may no longer be possible to attain the core objectives of the war at a sufficiently low cost account as victory. Now, discussions of war quite often fall into a trap where we think about war as a binary, or the outcome of war as a binary, victory or defeat, kind of like a sports match. But the outcome of war in truth lies on a spectrum. And there are a wide range of different possible results, from decisive success through to partial success, a draw, partial failure, or decisive failure. So what this means is there are many different kinds of unwinnable conflict. To take an extreme scenario, you might have a situation where the only outcome is total defeat. Let's say Germany in 1945. But there are other kinds of unwinnable wars where there are a wider range of possible results. So here I'm going to focus on a particular kind of unwinnable war that I call a fiasco. And this is a campaign of limited US interests that turns into a quagmire. So we're not talking here about wars of national survival like World War II. We're talking about expeditionary campaigns with restricted interests. If the enemy resistance is stronger than anticipated, then achieving the core goals of the war may cost too much blood and treasure, reap too small a benefit. And since the war only involves limited stakes for the US, presidents cannot keep fighting indefinitely. So in this kind of fiasco scenario, victory decisive victory is not achievable, but there are still many different results possible, from perhaps a partial success all the way through to a complete catastrophe. So what this means is there is still potentially a great deal to play for, strategically and morally. The difference between a draw and a debacle may equate to the lives of thousands of American soldiers or hundreds of thousands of civilians. We're going to focus here on the recent American experience of fiascos. Since 1945, the United States has fought 5 major wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But only in the Gulf War did victory remain on the table. In other words, in terms of victory in major war, the US is 1 for 5. In October 1950, China intervened in the Korean War, and the war became unwinnable. Decisive success, or the overthrow of the North Korean regime, was no longer a plausible outcome at a reasonable cost. A decade later, the US suffered another fiasco in Vietnam. Certainly by 1966, decisive victory or the creation of a secure, independent South Vietnam could not be achieved at a reasonable cost, because our allies, South Vietnam, lacked legitimacy, and the North Vietnamese displayed incredible commitment. More recently, we've seen 2 further fiascos. In 2001, the US overthrew the Taliban regime at very low cost, but Washington demonstrated only a modest commitment to rebuilding the Afghan state. The Taliban recovered, and by 2006, the war in Afghanistan was unwinnable. Taliban attacks, for example, tripled just in that 1 year. And of course, there was another fiasco in Iraq, where, as I mentioned earlier, by 2004, the Iraq war was unwinnable. The prospect of stabilizing the country receded into the distance. Why do we lose these wars? Why has America changed its military record from almost unbroken series of victories up to 1945 to a 1 for 5 record? Well, I won't talk too much about this, but fundamentally, the nature of war has changed after 1945. And we saw a shift from interstate wars between countries, to primarily civil wars. About 90% of wars today are civil wars. And in this new battlefield environment, the United States really struggled to adapt and found itself fighting in culturally alien environments in places like Vietnam and Iraq. So how can leaders fight an unwinnable war in a just manner? Interestingly, just war theory has largely neglected this question. So if you read just war theory, the underlying assumption within it is that victory is still possible. So leaders are told to pick a war they can win, achieve victory without resorting to barbarism, and then impose a just settlement after the enemy surrenders. That's the kind of the basic model. And this inattention to, well, what do you do if you can't win, right, is actually pretty surprising, partly because of America's recent record of quagmires. It's also particularly surprising because Vietnam spurred a wave of just war theory research, including Michael Waltz's book. He says Vietnam was the major inspiration. And the stakes are extremely significant. After all, fighting a just war is problematic enough when you can achieve victory. But now the United States is reeling from battlefield loss. The war effort is unraveling. By definition, the US has already violated one of the tenets of just war theory, which is a reasonable chance of success, right? That has already been violated. The original goals of the war may well have been a just cause, but those goals may well be receding into the distance. And the United States may be at least partly at fault for the deteriorating campaign. For example, poor US planning or overconfidence may have contributed to the quagmire, like it certainly did in Iraq. And therefore, arguably, we have a particular responsibility, a moral responsibility to the local people. But at the same time, the worsening battlefield means that the US has a reduced capacity to shape the outcomes of the war. So we have more responsibility and we have less influence. And interestingly, this is something I didn't put in the paper, but I wanted to add, is that another reason that quagmires are fascinating for issues of justice is that the American public and elite sensitivity to American war crimes or other ethical issues varies starkly depending on the kind of war we fight. So Americans are far less sensitive to US war crimes when we fight winnable interstate wars. right? So when we're fighting a war like World War II, then we tend to see it as a good versus evil crusade, and there is virtually no concern about US war crimes. For example, in World War II, the US ended up deliberately targeting civilians. It was largely uncontroversial. Why? Because we have this sort of crusading idealistic view of the war, as well as a retributive and vengeful strand to American thinking, for example, against the Japanese in World War II. And the bright, shining justice of the goal obscures all the sins of the crusader. But in an unwinnable counterinsurgency war, and the great majority of our unwinnable conflicts have been counterinsurgency wars, Americans are interestingly far more sensitive to US war crimes. Indeed, the only cases in US history where American war crimes were controversial were all counterinsurgency wars. Philippines, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those are the only 4 cases I could find in recent American history. Even though objectively the degree of war crimes was not necessarily greater than in other interstate crusades. Why is this? Because counterinsurgency unwinnable wars lack the good versus evil moral clarity of interstate war. So how can officials end a failing war in a just manner? Which values must be sacrificed in a bid to end the fighting? Do we have an obligation to fix what we destroyed and save our friends? Or must we be willing to abandon our allies in a bid to end a failing venture? So there are many different aspects and challenges to an exit strategy from war, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of them in this talk, and I'm happy to discuss other aspects in the Q&A. So if victory is an unrealistic goal, then leaders need to choose a viable exit plan to cut America's losses, safeguard America's interests, and protect the rights of civilians and soldiers. A fiasco is not an excuse to abandon the pursuit of justice. But the exit strategy will almost certainly involve some compromise or outright sacrifice of moral principle. The key to extricating the nation from an unwinnable conflict is to redefine the goals of the war. This is the single most important thing the US needs to do in wartime. So goals here refer to political aims. Who's going to rule territory and how? A fiasco implies that the original objectives are unattainable at a realistic price in blood and treasure, and so they must be rethought. There will be no triumphant peace. There will be no ticker-tape parade. Now, just war theory states that victory must be achievable. And this might imply that once a war becomes unwinnable, then that war is inherently unjust, and you should conclude it immediately. But actually, I think that that is wrong. In a fiasco, cutting and running is rarely an ethical choice. There is a stark difference between a potential conflict and a war that has already begun. Precipitously ending a military operation may produce severe strategic and ethical costs, potentially the entire collapse of the war effort, a humanitarian crisis. Having caused, at least in part, the negative consequences for other people, then American leaders do incur a responsibility to mitigate the damage. But although leaders should not abandon the campaign, they must select a narrower set of goals. Right? A fiasco implies that the US lacks the capabilities to achieve its original aims. We should therefore reduce the ambition of the objectives and align the ends and means of war. This is the basis of strategy, but it's also ethical. The futile pursuit of a cause is unjust, and so the war aims must be consistent with possibility. So how do we do this? Well, of course, leaders must carefully assess the strategic stakes, probable costs and benefits of each objective, allied support, public backing, and so on. But they also need to consider the ethical dimension. And the ambition of the war aims will depend significantly on the underlying justice of the mission. So if the war began in accordance with just war principles, a last resort, self-defense for a compelling moral purpose, then we can justify relatively more expansive goals even if we're stuck in a difficult campaign. As the fundamentals of the war deviate from just war principles, then appropriate war aims will become more modest. But I want to make a crucial point, which is that the justice of war aims may evolve significantly during the military operation. For example, the US may initiate a regime change mission which does not satisfy the ad bellum just war conditions, say in Iraq. But once the regime is toppled, if the target country then destabilizes, the task of providing security and representative government to the population may be considered just. So the overall war is not somehow retrospectively rehabilitated, but the original murky ethics of the invasion do not obscure a new, powerful moral purpose that may, in fact, it could imply extra responsibility to clean up the mess. So let me just mention a couple of cases so you can see how leaders rethought war aims either ethically or not ethically. In the Korean War, when it became unwinnable in 1950 after China intervened, Truman wisely chose to reduce the war aims. Basically, the US abandoned very quickly this idea of liberating North Korea and settled on the aim of negotiated peace and the defense of South Korea. This was strategically wise, and it was also morally justifiable. But if you look at other cases, Washington has struggled to redefine its goals. So in Vietnam, for example, we failed to adjust our objectives, even as the price of the war escalated, even as victory receded. LBJ maintained the maximal goal of an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. What about Richard Nixon? Well, in his defense, you can say he withdrew US forces steadily and negotiated what he called peace with honor with Hanoi. However, his policy also involved significant escalation, invading Laos and Cambodia, dramatically stepping up the bombing of North Vietnam, and so on. An additional 20,000 Americans were killed during the Nixon presidency, along with hundreds of thousands of civilians and North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers. And peace with honor was fundamentally an illusion, because the administration knew that Hanoi's military victory was just a matter of time. In fact, they were clear, both Kissinger and Nixon were clear about this in private. Instead, what Kissinger pursued was what he called a decent interval between the United States leaving and the final collapse of South Vietnam. And I would say that a decent interval is an insufficient moral basis to keep a war going that involves thousands of dead Americans and hundreds of thousands of dead Vietnamese. Indeed, tragically, the terms that the US gained in 1973 were actually worse than the terms that North Vietnam had offered back in 1965, 8 years before. In Iraq, US war aims were also unjust. Interestingly, though, it was for the opposite reason, too little commitment. So when Iraq became a fiasco in 2004, Washington pursued an exit plan that was known as, quote, leave to win. That was the name of it. And it was based on withdrawing as soon as possible. The Bush administration was fiercely opposed to any idea of nation building. This was just anathema. And instead, what the White House wanted to do was hand over sovereignty as quickly as possible to US allies in Iraq and handpick supporters, let Baghdad take the lead in providing security, pull American troops back to forward operating bases, and ideally reduce the number of US troops to 100,000 within a year or so. The predictable result of this strategy was further chaos. Baghdad could not take the initiative in providing security because government forces in Iraq often moonlighted as death squads. And in fact, in 2005-2006, Iraqi civilian deaths almost doubled. So what we see there is that the ethical and strategic success of this revised goals varied significantly. In Korea, they were relatively just, in part because the underlying rationale for the war in Korea was a just war, the defense of South Korea, and arguably the underlying rationale for both Vietnam and Iraq wasn't a just war. What distinguished Vietnam and Iraq? Well, what I would say is that, first of all, the cause in Vietnam was never just, and it was not just in Iraq, as I mentioned. But the key difference in terms of the US showing too much commitment in Vietnam and too little commitment in Iraq is the battlefield reality. The strength of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong meant that the United States should have moved more quickly to negotiate a deal. But in Iraq, the insurgency lacked the capabilities or legitimacy of the Viet Cong. And so even if decisive victory was not attainable in Iraq, the goal of improving security was plausible. The solution, therefore, of leave to win simply compounded America's moral error. So we need to revise our goals, and that's the number one rule. A second principle is that an unwinnable war will likely require a shift to a negotiated compromise peace. Indeed, every single American fiasco since 1945, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, they all involved extensive bargaining with the enemy. American culture is often skeptical about the idea of negotiating with evil enemies. That's true in wartime, but it's even true in peacetime. The Iran nuclear deal, for example, is far more controversial in the US than it is in any of the other American allies that negotiated the deal. Partly this reflects the moralism of American society. So we see negotiation as sullying America's deepest values. It's also partly American power, which means that we tend to think we just don't need to negotiate. But wartime negotiations are certainly ethically challenging. There are profound differences in moral values, for example, between US ideals and, say, North Vietnamese communism or Taliban's commitment to an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan. The enemy may have committed gross human rights violations, and there are certain extreme cases, like, for example, ISIS, where there may be little potential for peace talks. But once a war becomes unwinnable, justice typically requires a negotiated end to the fighting. How else will the United States achieve long-term peace and the protection of national interests and human rights? And there is a danger of rejecting negotiation on ethical grounds and then suffering greater moral injury later on. For instance, in 2003, Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, received a memo. And the memo suggested that the US reach out to Sunni insurgents, the insurgency was just beginning in Iraq. Well, Wolfowitz read the memo, and then he wrote 3 words in the margin. And the 3 words were, "They are Nazis," right? And what that captured is this good versus evil mentality. We don't negotiate with terrorists, et cetera, but that was extremely dangerous. In fact, diplomacy has proved effective in unwinnable wars. In 2006, 2007, 3 years too late, the US negotiated an alliance, and we heard about this yesterday, with Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq, signed up tens of thousands of Sunnis for the Awakening Councils and the Sons of Iraq program, and it helped pull Iraq back from the brink of total civil war. The American diplomat Richard Holbrooke said he did not regret bargaining with immoral opponents. Quote, "If you can prevent the deaths of people still alive, you're not doing a disservice to those already killed by trying to do so." What about war crimes trials? Well, many just war theorists see trials or tribunals as morally indispensable. It's often seen as a key part of fighting a just war that you end with war crimes trials and so on. Well, in an unwinnable war, there is far less scope for war crimes tribunals. Battlefield loss means the adversary cannot be forced to appear before a Nuremberg-style trial. So in Afghanistan today, for example, if we insist on war crimes trials, dragging the Taliban leadership to The Hague, then it's going to make a peace deal impossible. But there does remain scope for targeting abuses on one's own side. For example, the United States punished the guards at Abu Ghraib with prison terms and hard labor. What about barbarism? Well, the principles of in bello are designed to restrain the barbarism of war, particularly drawing a distinction between combatants and innocent civilians. So when exiting from a quagmire, when facing battlefield defeat, can American leaders embrace barbarism? Well, it is tempting, right? In the face of enemy resistance, it's tempting to take the gloves off. And also, when a war is unwinnable, the US may seek to signal its credibility and strength through destructive acts. So in December 1972, just weeks before the peace deal in Vietnam, Nixon launched the Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, which caused widespread devastation in North Vietnam. According to the Hanoi, it killed 1,600 civilians. Now, the practical benefit of the bombing was minimal. The two sides signed a deal a few weeks later that essentially had been on the table since the previous October. The bombing was about optics. It was about creating the impression of bombing the North into submission and demonstrating American credibility even as the US withdrew. I would suggest the Christmas bombing is indefensible by just war standards because it extracted a grave price in civilian deaths for a dubious symbolic benefit. Now, Walzer argues that the restraints on war can be overridden in what he calls a supreme emergency, right? When you have an imminent risk of great evil, the enslavement of your population, like Britain in 1940. But fiascos rarely, if ever, represent a supreme emergency. You know, when a US campaign in a country like Vietnam or Afghanistan unravels, the heavens are not going to come crashing down on America. And therefore, the core principle of proportionality should be protected. Most US fiascos have been in counterinsurgency campaigns, which provide, as you know, particular challenges for in bello. For example, the insurgent enemy may hide among the people, complicating the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Adversaries may deliberately target civilians in terrorist attacks. But even in asymmetric war, American soldiers are expected to avoid targeting civilians. Indeed, there are powerful strategic reasons to reject barbarism in counterinsurgency campaigns. One of the basic principles of counterinsurgency or coin doctrine is to outgovern the guerrillas and win hearts and minds through minimal force and the protection of the rule of law. One danger in an unwinnable war is that leaders may become attached to a single moral principle that can dominate a wider and more complex ethical calculus. And I want to give an illustration of this that some of you may not be familiar with, but is fascinating and was very important, and it's from the Korean War. So a key notion of in bello is that prisoners of war have rights and should be considered immune from harm. But in Korea, the protection of prisoners' rights ended up having perverse consequences. So the two sides began negotiations in 1951, and by early 1952, essentially all of the issues had been dealt with, including what you think would be the toughest issues, like the borders between North and South Korea. The only issue left on the table was the prisoners of war. And the North demanded the traditional all-for-all swap. We give them all our prisoners, they give us all their prisoners, which was consistent with the Geneva Conventions. But President Truman decided, as a basic moral principle, that captured communist prisoners must be allowed to defect if they wanted to. In other words, the US would not forcibly send back captives who wanted to stay in the quote-unquote free world. Now, there were some admittedly strategic reasons for this, the propaganda benefits of prisoners staying in the free world. But the evidence suggests that the main objective was humanitarian. Some of the prisoners actually were South Koreans who'd been drafted into the North Korean army as it marched south, and so they legitimately wanted to go to their homes. There was also some guilt about what happened after World War II, where Soviet prisoners who were liberated had actually been forcibly sent back to Stalin, and most of them ended up in the gulags. And Truman, in his diary, spoke passionately and morally that it's a core principle he would not send back these people for slavery. Michael Walzer, interestingly, in his book, comes down on Truman's side and says that he was right to uphold this principle, and this was an example of where there are, quote, moral reasons for prolonging a war, end quote. Well, in Walzer's defense, 22,000 communist prisoners were able to defect. Okay, that's in the plus side. But there was an extraordinary price paid for this moral principle. For one thing, it was difficult to work out which communist prisoners actually wanted to defect, because in the prison camps in South Korea, it was actually anti-communist prisoners who ran the barracks. And so they would ask people, do you want to defect? And anyone who said no would be beaten up. So it wasn't clear if it was actually a free and fair process. And the issue turned into an issue of ideals and morals and principles and reputation for the two sides, neither of whom would back down. So Truman said to the American people, quote, "We will not buy an armistice by turning over human beings for slaughter or slavery." This single issue ended up prolonging the war for 15 months. So remember, in the plus side, 22,000 prisoners were allowed to defect to the West. Well, here's the negative side. 9,000 Americans were killed during that time. 100,000 Allied troops were killed. 3,600 American prisoners had to stay in prison for another 15 months because of the continuing war. Every North Korean city was obliterated by carpet bombing, killing 800,000 North Korean civilians. It was only when Stalin died in the spring of 1953 that the communists backed down on the issue of repatriation and a peace deal was reached. So it's hard to avoid the conclusion that even though the communists and Stalin, I think, bear a greater share of moral responsibility, that Truman fixated on this single principle, and with more prudent analysis of likely consequences and less moralistic rhetoric, we could have found a compromise that might have ended the war months earlier. So a couple of final thoughts. The pursuit of justice does not end when troops leave. In fact, there are still significant ripple effects after a negative war. For example, we should provide aid to refugees escaping from the war zone, assistance for allies on the ground, for example, translators. This is a huge issue, helping translators who have often put their lives at risk to help Americans and to stop them from facing vengeance. We need to provide physical and mental health resources to veterans who face particular challenges coming back from an unwinnable war where they don't have the solace of victory. At the broader level, justice also requires a reckoning of the lessons of the military campaign. How can future debacles be averted? What are the hard lessons of war? And interestingly, fiascos are an opportunity to change. The way we learn, both as individuals and as countries, is not by winning, it's by losing, right? It is failure that gets people to change their personal behavior, and it's failure that can get countries to change their national policy. And so difficult wars like Iraq and Afghanistan are actually a huge opportunity to take a real hard look at US foreign policy, US military policy, etc., and really think about root and branch reform. Over time, we can look to reconcile with the adversary. For example, there was a long process that has ultimately culminated in reconciliation with Vietnam, and now US and Vietnam may well be close allies in the coming century, given fear of a rising China. So just to conclude very briefly, extricating the US from a quagmire in a just manner may be the greatest challenge a president can face in all of politics. Nothing is as tough as getting out of a failing war. The stakes are high. A lesser loss versus a greater loss may represent life or death for millions, as well as impacting a president's career, America's global reputation. So leaders should typically reduce the ambition of the goals, but not just cut and run from the war. They should negotiate with the adversary, limit the role of war crimes trials, maintain restraints on barbarism, and avoid fixating on a single ethical principle. The justice of military campaigns may be more fluid and evolving than is often thought. Wars that start as an unjust regime change mission may later acquire a just cause to protect civilians from extremist groups. And finally, quagmires may represent an opportunity to rethink and develop just war theory. It is interesting that it's tough wars like Vietnam that often trigger renewed interest and scholarship in just war theory. So difficult campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan may therefore provide fresh analysis about the ethics of fighting in an age of counterinsurgency, terrorism, and drone strikes. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I guess the first note of thanks I'm sure you all get me to is just appreciation. I think Professor Tierney does a really amazing job of really calling our attention to the importance of this problem and how I guess kind of lamentable it is that scholars are not giving it sufficient attention. I would say that this, at least in my field of theology, this is not a topic that we are devoting enough attention to. So I hope that your paper has very, very broad. My second kind of note of appreciation, I actually think Professor Tierney, perhaps implicitly at this stage, makes a contribution to just war theory itself, in addition to the explicit problem of what to do when a war becomes unwinnable. I actually think that he suggests that determinations of just cause and right intention, which are typically kind of clustered or cloistered in just ad bellum considerations, actually belong to every phase of just war thinking. In other words, it's not just something you decide at the beginning what the cause is or what the intention is. It's something that you are always reassessing, have to reinterrogate. And in the sense that in the case of intention, I think especially your intentions might actually change as your behavior changes. All right, so suggestions for further development. So I don't have a lot of knowledge or information to contribute to kind of in-war calculations should also approach these issues from a virtue theory perspective. So rather than looking at wars as a disconnected series of events or simply decisions and reactions to various external circumstances, what if we looked at wars as also an expression of a country's corporate character, right, or moral identity? And if we do that, then we also have to look at what are the United States' habits of wars. So I think this might change a little bit, and perhaps help how we apply just war theory. So we see, first of all, that character, we kind of compare a country to an individual or agent, not a perfect comparison, but after all, if we're talking about just war theory, we're ultimately asking about the justice of the country's actions, not really necessarily the justice of the individual person, right? So we do have some sense that countries can have a moral identity, even if it's backwards. So I think what virtue theory comes to remember is that actions, in this case of the country, build habits, which is virtue. But it also reminds us that the relation flows the other way as well. Just as we become what we do, so do we often do what we have become. So they go together. And I think in addition to asking what should we do going forward, we should ask who are we? Who are we as a nation? And perhaps who should we become? And I also think too that virtue theory, especially as informed by Augustine and all of you choice appropriate, because we're really know about Augustine in school, reminds us that moral actions, especially ones that are out of the habit, do not simply result from bad thinking. It's not simply a problem of what don't we understand, but they can also emerge out of bad will. In other words, it's not always the case that one knows better when we do that. It's kind of like the overall worldview. So we follow it together, or that was kind of very slowly. You know better to do that. Well, sometimes that's true, right? But unfortunately, it's a mystic, or a kind of virtue theory can help us see that sometimes one must want to do better before we can know how to do better. Or, more pessimistically, sometimes one knows better but still does not want to do better. So then if we apply this to a country and understand countries as a type of moral agent, then we have to assess the content not just of a country's character, but of its will, right? Its intentions. What is it want? What is it trying to achieve? And we must also accept the possibility that a given country, including our own, may occasionally act out of that will. Okay? It doesn't need to be some sort of wholesale condemnation of a given country, just as individuals, can be moral characteristics common. Right? Someone can be a good person, but they can have kind of, bad habits, right? It doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing kind of assessment. Even perhaps in the course of examining why countries pursue a certain goal itself, it might be this way. I also like this approach because I think sometimes we, and this is a term we over-existentialize evil that can happen in the world. So in other words, when I say over-existentialize, this is an approach that maybe overestimates the extent to which the evils and tragedies that happen in the world occur due to finitude or bad luck, or things that are outside of human control. I mean, it's certainly the case that war does kind of plunge the human person into heightened case of just kind of impossible to move in situations and dilemmas. I do think we can sometimes overestimate the case to which that's true. So in other words, we mustn't do more than learn from mistakes, right? But we must also assess kind of the righteousness of our will. And I'm talking about our country as a whole. I'm talking about any individual country. I think this is actually also triggered in the So I think that if we perceive the United States as a world agent capable of harboring bad habits, which natural vices, as well as good ones, natural virtues, I think it helps us address one of the questions that helps us address the questions for Tierney, which I believe are similar to ones posed by the conservative critic of war and terror and Basicich, who basically asks why this repeated disparity between perceived and actual outcomes. Why have American output successes led so regularly to war violence and disorder? And as Professor Tierney rightly points out, since the Second World War, it seems as though these fiascos, or back debacles, are much more the rule than the exception. It seems almost as though these situations have come almost in habit or express some sort of pact. The pattern is in the Islamic world was debatable, but to me seems particularly clear. What we have done to defeat one enemy has created an even bigger and sometimes even more destructive enemy. Which started with interventions in Afghanistan against the Soviets. So we might also need to ask, perhaps this pattern of corporate behavior is not just a succession of mistakes or an inability to figure out how to recognize the changing order or their circumstances, but maybe also an expression of corporate character. In other words, how many times does the country have to do the same thing, same implications, before we conclude that it's doing it intentionally or it's stressing something about it? So I think I'll just close, I think, by, I'll just close there and say, I think so. I think we need to start thinking about who we are as a country and how that divides what we are doing. I think, in a sense, I think war is not just in the chaos of war with father, but even in the decisions to go to war and the strategies to accomplish it, is less rational than we think it is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do think we need to take more seriously the extent to which countries let people act for a competing mix of drives and desires. And I think that will help us go forward to maybe recognize why we are in this situation and what we can do to handle that better.
At this point, it's always proper to thank Dr. Wilson for the session. But because it's specifically the paper I get to respond to, I really mean it. I'm really grateful because this is such an important topic. And a little background on why I'm so passionate about questions. I'm really a push on some things that are really passionate about getting to the right answers. In 2011, I was the company commander of the Peshawar Valley, which is home to the Cornwall and Shirayat valleys. And when the national strategy changed to one around key terrain districts, we started to collect our forces from some more distant areas and pull them around places like district centers in the South that was closest, in an effort of lesser aims, that we could connect our district centers with their provincial government and ultimately bring them off to the national government. And an effort's a very real thing, right? The strategic impact, a very tactical, immediate impact of a gross increase in violence. Because for very practical reasons, the enemy in that valley wanted to harbor this narrative that they forced us out, that we, went running and screaming from them, they kicked us out. So the uptick in violence at the tactical level was very real. We must acknowledge that capturing this broader narrative of strategic level will have those immediate impacts and why it's such a serious question. But it's not all bad news. I was 2 years earlier a company executive officer in Haiphong during the awakening that you referenced. And we saw the local, really teenagers who became more or less a neighborhood watch, but in a culture that's very normal for everyone else in 1947. And they basically took their own streets back. And we facilitated when we took the lead there. And at the micro level, perhaps that was the lead to one that I didn't mention before. So I've seen on both sides, and I've seen it very anecdotally and episodically. And the fact that you're asking these questions to arrive at what do we capture as the theory that we put into new models is such an important question. So I really am honored and thank you for the opportunity to be able to take this up. I'm not sure what I actually wrote. I won't say that. Professor Tierney keeps his paper around this thesis, right? To maximize justice when campaigns in retreat, leaders should limit the war aims, resist pressure to resort to barbarism, embrace negotiations with the adversary, and seek the best possible peace from the range of plausible alternatives. Similarly, I will organize my comments around this specifically the first three, which is the time. But before we can get into that, we have to first ask the question, when is a campaign a retreat? Professor Tierney answers this question by way of identifying the third principle he used to follow, which is that there should be a high probability of success to avoid expending lives in a futile endeavor. Once that principle is compromised, the military should retreat. And I ask this question, are we approaching that question from the right perspective? Brian Arendt suggests that there's a presumption in favor of committing some kind of moral response, even when the odds of military success, however defined, seem long. Communities contemplating war, and in our case, to continue their war, in response to aggression must consider whether such an extreme measure has any reasonable probability of success. That is the least we might say that they owe themselves. Emphasis on the last word there. I employ Arendt's language because he emphasizes that which motivates my question of perspective. We must acknowledge that those victims of aggression may desire to continue to fight regardless of the likelihood of the outcome. And we will have embroiled ourselves in such a way that we have impacted the assumptions and their understanding of things to make that decision. Our withdrawal may be interpreted by reasonable persons as a betrayal. I often follow an argument. If the major premise is if the innocent victims of some unjust aggression remain willing to resist and willing to subject themselves to the violence associated with that resistance, then they retain the right to continue that armed resistance with or without external support. My premise, there may someday be a conflict in which a state continues to resist while knowingly acknowledging the full likelihood of a protracted effort. The resistance of the state has greater likelihood of succeeding with the support of a capable external actor. And so we might conclude that external actor remains justified in supporting that resistance as long as the local force, as long as they serve the pleasure of the local force in their defense. And so I ask, are we really considering that principle from a proper perspective? And now to begin with prescriptions, leaders should limit the warnings. Professor Tierney demands that, although leaders should not abandon the campaign, they must select a narrower set of goals. He goes on to say that Walter argued that just war involves limited goals since international order rests on norms of accommodation and restraint. And I'll add further that Walter says, what is objectionable is when idealism sets goals that cannot possibly be reached, for which soldiers can only die in vain. This is his portion on unconditional surrenders. Walter remains tightly woven around a minimalist convention that requires a restricted and limited attention at the outset of the war. So my question follows, if what we might term moving the goalposts closer and shortening our aims is reasonably expected to still meet some just end, isn't that what it should have been in the first place? The second point, to resist pressure to resort to barbarism. Barbarism or failure to attend any of the use of developed principles must occur only in most extreme cases of state of supreme emergency. I agree with all Dr. Tierney's points there, and I have nothing further to add, as I believe that as we usually do. I ask this question instead. One is far short of barbarism. Accepting that violence remains, in all likelihood, a necessary means toward even a lesser aim, that of withdrawal, I ask, of course, denying barbarism, upon what grounds does the combatant retain the license to any just employment of any level of violence? To adequately answer that question, we must spend a moment on how soldiers obtain the license to kill in the first place, and discuss the core principle of use development, the moral equality of combatants. Walter's position, the champion of the traditionalist or collectivist interpretation, states the following. An immediate problem is that soldiers who do fighting, though they can barely be said to have chosen to fight, lose the rights they're supposedly defending. They gain more rights as combatants and potential prisoners, but they can now be attacked and killed at the will of their enemies. Simply by fighting, whatever their private hopes and intentions, they have lost their title to life and liberty. And they have lost it even though, unlike the aggressor state, they have committed no crime. Soldiers are made to be killed. I'll say that falling. That is why war is such hell. But even if we take our standpoint of hell, we can still say that no one else is made to be killed. This distinction alone is the basis for all of our rules of war. One status, in Walter's interpretation of the traditional view, as a soldier or not, as a combatant or not, does all the work for whether or not they have a license to kill. And I think everything we discussed already about withdrawal for its lesser aims, they would retain that in regards to self-defense. So my question lies in the revisionist claim, championed by Jeff McMahon most popularly. The license to kill for the revisionist position comes from one's ends. Proceeding from our last point, that any lesser ends may surrender and not to any longer be considered fully just, I ask the following. If those ends achieved are less than just, do the combatants maintain the right to fight their way out? The question is, on what grounds are they licensed to kill? If doing little more than defending themselves against an enemy during the withdrawal. An enemy specifically that they may have engaged unjustly. if it compromised the principal probability of success in the first place. The next point, racing negotiations with the adversary. I agree again with everything Professor Tierney offers about the likelihood of variable negotiations with the adversary. And I particularly appreciate the historical reference to when it's been done both well and poorly. However, I'd like to shift the emphasis of negotiation toward a different party. Our position as a third-party force, together with the locals negotiating with the enemy, to one that is our negotiation with that local force. It is in all likelihood that the enemy interprets the locals' resistance as worthy of further punishment after the third party's departure. If the result leads to greater vulnerability and the almost certain punishment of those left behind, does the departing force assume a greater burden for a future return to the theater? Professor Tierney did not ignore this issue. He specifically acknowledged with this comment about the pottery barn rule in his paper. The very notion that you broke, you broke your bottom, I'm sorry. However, what I'm proposing is something different. I'm suggesting that there may be a longer lasting implication of the obligations you assume. Intervention by that third party, the defense of other claim, is discussed in most cases as a positive duty, an obligation to necessarily do a thing rather than restrain from a thing. When it becomes obvious that some state has been victimized by an unjust aggression, the question remains as to who inherits the obligation to set things right, who must defend that other. In her work, Responsibility and Global Justice, a Social Connection Model, Iris Marion Young suggests an answer to that question by way of a middle ground between the statist and the globalist. More recently, in Matthias Risse's work at Harvard, he uses the language of placing an intermediary position between the cosmopolitan and the humanitarian. Both of them are doing a similar project, but they determine that proximity and responsibility of the situation occurs over a spectrum, with those closer to the problem and more responsible for the outcomes admitting the larger obligation. My contention follows. The intervening force, by virtue of its having intervened, would in fact have a far greater obligation to act in that region sometime in the future. At least for some time, the violence that will likely ensue will in large part have been for the last intervention. If we admit this reality, and we see the increased future responsibilities, then does that consideration belong in the initial calculus as to whether or not we withdraw in the first place? That is to say, is it better to stay the course now, acknowledging the likelihood of our having to return at some point out of a duty-based ethic that proportionally sees the less responsible route? So I'll end the same way I began. I surely commend Professor Tierney. I think he's asking all the right questions, and I think he issues a challenge in the historical reference to creating Vietnam, such as to say that this is not without precedent. It's found throughout history, and I think we ought to get it right now, so it was in our future as well. Thank you again for the question. I appreciate this opportunity.
Sure, I'll just be very brief. First, let me commend both of the respondents for absolutely superb, incredibly thoughtful comments. Giving me a lot to think about. And I'm not going to go through every one. I think it would take a long time. Very interested in listening. Let me just say just a couple of quick things. It's absolutely true that, as I mentioned in the talk, which was very eloquently summarized, that when we think of just war theory, we think about it in terms of war initiation, but in fact, wars can go through multiple phases, and the justice of goals and so on may change significantly. The problem is that we are all susceptible to what's known as cognitive consistency, and so we're unwilling to be flexible in the way that we change our view. For example, a very plausible view of Iraq, the Iraq War, would be that the initiation of the war was completely wrong, but once we're there, we have a responsibility to protect the people and so on. But it's interesting how few Americans bought into that particular view. In other words, anti-war, pro-surge. Right? There were lots of Americans who were pro-war, pro-surge. Lots of Americans who were anti-war, anti-surge. Very few people were anti-war, pro-surge, even though that's a perfectly consistent position. And it's because of consistency, right? If you think something is bad, then we just want to see it bad in all respects. Well, war is not simple, right? And it's rarely good or bad in all respects. The issue about the wider society is absolutely fascinating, and absolutely brilliant. Obama actually talked about this repeatedly, where he said his goal was not just to end the Iraq War, but to end the mentality that got us into Iraq. But I would contend that Obama might have ended the Iraq War, the first part of the Iraq War, we're back now. But I'm not sure he's ended the mentality, probably because of precedent part in the mentality, because there are some deep-rooted elements elements of American culture, moralism, idealism, the way in which American power shapes American thinking, and also psychological dynamics. So they're very difficult for any president to change. So there's wide societal issues that we need to reflect on, I think, absolutely. Just to pick up on the last of a great many fascinating points that just said there. On the pottery barn rule, you guys are probably familiar already with the pottery barn rule. You break it, you own it. Turns out, by the way, this is not Pottery Barn's rule. And they got very upset when Colin Powell and others put this forward as the Pottery Barn rule. If you go to a Pottery Barn store and break something, it's just written off, right? You don't own it, right? So they got so much that way. Nevertheless, it's not that it's the Pottery Barn principle, which doesn't work in Pottery Barn, but does work very well in this great historical. And the fundamental tension that lies behind it in the context of a difficult war is that our responsibility to deal with the damage has gone up, including potentially returning to the country later on, possibly, right? But our capabilities and our capacity to alter the battlefield environment has gone down. And so that's the fundamental dynamic that lies at the heart of a lot of these issues. And leading me to oftentimes to think we need to be highly pragmatic and realistic about what is achievable. On the other hand, what we can search for are alternative paths to try to limit the damage in terms of justice. So if we do have to leave the war earlier than we planned, if we can't go back even though there's great humanitarian stuff, there may be other mechanisms such as dealing with refugees, helping America's allies and translators and so on, etc., that can limit the damage in ways that are not narrowly military. And that's a way to at least mitigate some of the loss and deal somewhat with that inherent tension.
Excellent. Thank you so much for our panel. At this point, the floor is open. It looks like we have a couple of runners with microphones. So what we ask is if you put your hands up, and we'll take questions from the audience. How about back in the corner? Start there. We'll on from there.
Hi.
We have one job, Sam.
Dr. Tierney, I was curious about your reliance on the Korean War as a case to explain a morally justifiable decision to abandon war claims, particularly in light of America's history in Korea since 1905, where Korea was bartered to Japan in exchange for peace between Japan and Russia, which then resulted in decades of genocide, oppression, and looting of the Korean people. And then in 1945, the Moscow decision, through the several hundred declassified memos that went along with that decision, that basically said Korea needs to be under trusteeship from the United States because the Korean people are unable to govern themselves. And as you well know, the president of South Korea did not sign that armistice agreement that ended the Korean War. So I have a couple of questions. One is, to what degree is this sense of morally justifiable action of narrowing the goals of a particular fiasco by which America, I believe, historically contributed to that, a bit myopic? And then the second one is, to what degree is your suggestion actually taking into consideration the changes in administration? So you have Roosevelt in 1905, you have several different administrations that didn't change and potentially changed their shift in commitments to battle. So I was wondering what you were thinking about that kind of control for that problem.
So thank you for the question. So what I was referring to in the talk is the critical decision made in the winter of 1950 to 51, which is about how the United States would respond to Chinese intervention in Korea. So, as you know, the U.S. entered the Korean War initially with the goal of freeing South Korea from invasion. And then the decision was made in the late summer fall to allow Douglas MacArthur to cross over and roll backwards in the north. And MacArthur was certain that China would not intervene, and even though China signaled that in fact it would intervene, the US had basically ignored those communications and were struck by several hundred thousand Chinese troops in October and November. This led to one of the greatest battlefield defeats in American military history. There are extraordinary stories of American soldiers retreating in horrific, freezing conditions, incredibly brave. But it was a battlefield defeat, and they were pushed back initially south of Seoul, and then the lines stabilized. So the question is, what should Truman have done? Now, he made the decision to limit the war aims. He made the decision to abandon the goal of liberating North Korea and instead accept a negotiated deal that would return, broadly speaking, to the status quo and to develop. Now, there was a clear moral cost to that, and also some strategic costs, right? Just look today, the North Korean people live in a terrible totalitarian regime. The human rights abuses are horrific and so on. But I would argue that there was no real alternative for the United States at that time. What they were facing was a dramatically greater war. So there were figures in the United States who wanted to expand the war. MacArthur was open to this, basically take the war to China. But what that war would have looked like is a vastly greater regional conflict in which we may well have seen tens or hundreds of thousands of American dead. Almost certainly the United States would have used atomic weapons. They almost used them as it was. They certainly would have used them if it turned into a broader conflict against China. China and the Soviet Union had a defense pact, so the Soviet Union would probably have been drawn into that conflict as well. And so my reading of it is that in an incredibly difficult crisis situation, with no good option, the decision to fight to save South Korea but no longer liberate North Korea was the best alternative. And I think that the war could have been wrapped up sooner if there'd been more flexible diplomacy on the POW issue. But trying to keep a war going to liberate North Korea, I think we would have ended up liberating a land of ashes.